questions, and Erwin's presentation is coming up on the screen right now.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Naomi?
Yep, I can hear you.
Good. I just need to move boxes around so that I can see my presentation properly. Trying to get it to go full screen. And then, okay, there we go. I think that everybody can see it. I'll hide my button on the side so that hopefully you can hear it. Erin and I are going to try and co-present, so hopefully that will be quite smooth. And I think it's nice that we're following on the presentation just before us, because it actually leads, you know, it's connected to what we were doing as well. And so the project that I'm going to talk about today is still in progress. Everybody knows what happened this year to all kinds of research. And so what we're going to talk you through is what our intention was and what we ended up with and where we're going to go next. So the background to the study is kind of, you know, linked to what the previous presenter mentioned, that, you know, there's a lot of kind of talk about multilingual pedagogies and a lot of research about kind of, you know, the soft effects and how people feel about it, but there's not a lot of research on the impact of you know, explicit translanguaging pedagogy. And part of that's because there's, you know, a lot of fragmentation and definition of translanguaging, what it is, and just a kind of a lack of empirical research that would guide us to clearly see that if we do this, there's an impact on that, or if we do this, there's no impact. Following on from that, research on translanguaging pedagogy in multilingual classes is minimal as well. So a lot of the research, not all of it, but a lot of it is in bilingual contexts. And of course, classes where students, you know, speak 14 languages are very different from classes where students speak 2 or 3. And in the context in which I work, which is mainly international schools, research on the impact of translanguaging in a multilingual international school class is really almost, but not quite, non-existent. And so, you know, what we tend to do is we tend to look at research done in other contexts and try and generalize it to our context. But that's problematic because our students are not the same, our teachers are not the same, our curricula are not the same. So this study was really kind of, you know, aims to be a first step in developing a body of research. Based on this kind of, you know, this overwhelmingly positive response from teachers that I work with, who use translanguaging strategies that feel kind of innately as teachers that it has a positive impact on their students. But what we wanted to try and do is take that feeling and see if there's evidence behind it. So the research questions that we were looking to answer were, what, if any, impact does planned pedagogical translanguaging have on English language writing in particular in an EMI context in different subjects? And then the secondary question was, what are student and teacher perceptions of the intentional use of the first language in the classroom? And so just to, you know, to start with our definition of translanguaging, because as I mentioned, it, you know, it's kind of fragmented right now. We go all the way back to the original definition from the Welsh School of the planned and systematic use of 2 languages inside the same lesson by specifying and varying the languages of input and output is the original Welsh definition. I add processing because the translanguaging cycle that I implement with teachers is input, processing, and output. And I think the processing is really important in multilingual classes. But essentially, we're working from this original definition that gives us a kind of a, you know, a curricular framework in which we can implement something. So I am going to hand over to Erin to talk about the context of the project. So that means I am going to need to mute myself and unmute Erin. Is that possible?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Yoan. So what's the context of the project? We are a boarding school in Switzerland, in Francophone Switzerland, and we are a secondary school with students grades 7 through 12. So I guess in the UK that would be grades 8 through 13, and students are about 12 to 18 or 19 years old. It's we have students from 50 countries, and you know, as a boarding school, they're all on site here, but during the last stage of our research cycle, we were doing it remotely in 14 time zones. We are an English medium instruction school, but about I think about 80% of our students speak another language at home. And for many of them, this is their first experience studying entirely in English, although many of them have studied English and their national educational systems back at home before they come here. Of course, students aren't living with their families, so they also get English through the residential program and activities program. So we wanted to investigate, could their home language or first language be beneficial for their learning, but also in terms of maintaining their first language development while they're studying in an English medium context. So I'll go into our methodology, which came through guidance from AOWIN. We did 3 sort of academic task cycles, one in the autumn on site, one in the winter on site, and then in the spring we did everything remotely because of the pandemic. Students returned home in March, and we did everything through our Google suite of education apps, including Google Classroom. But we looked specifically and deliberately at how we could plan for a multilingual pedagogical approach in terms of giving students input, how they could process the information and learning, and how they demonstrated their learning through language production or output. So basically, with guidance from AOWIN, we decided that we would plan to have students largely get some of the input of their content through their home language. And this was often through self-selected text that students chose with some guidance from the teachers. In terms of the processing aspect, we asked students often to work in small collaborative groups where they could, if they had a shared home language, because we have something like 26 home languages at the school, they could use those in class. And then in the drafting stages of language output, and specifically writing, because that was what our research question was focused on, we would also ask them to draft in their first language as well. There were 4 teachers participating, 4 different classes. 2 of them were English language classes. I was one of the participating teachers. The English language classes were for the younger students, 7th and 8th grade, and then my classes are the 11th and 12th grade, and it's not international baccalaureate class. So my students were a bit higher proficiency. And then we had 2 content courses as well, a history class and a science class. And then the idea was to look at the written output at the end of each task cycle, the 3 tasks, the 3 cycles in the fall, winter, and the autumn, winter, and spring, to look for complexity of ideas, the depth of content understanding, and of course their English language development, how accurate and fluent they produced language through writing, and the sort of lexical variety that they had in their summative assessments. And then, of course, we wanted to see if we could measure any impact through the sort of intervention, the translanguaging strategies that we use against other cohorts, previous cohorts of students who'd done the same assessments. I'll pass it back to you, Eowyn.
Okay, thanks. So one of our big questions in terms of challenges and successes is how do we measure impact for students in terms of their English language writing, which is what we're trying to do. And one of the challenges that I've come across a lot in trying to do kind of explicit research on translanguaging is that in order to measure impact, we need to have a control group. So we have to have a group that does it and a group that doesn't, so we can see what the difference is. But when you're working with teachers who kind of have a deeply held belief that translanguaging is positive for their students, ethically, how do we ask them to use that particular pedagogy with one group of students and to not use it with another? For teachers, that feels kind of unfair to say, well, I really think this is positive, but I'm not going to do it with you in order to engage in research. And so some possible solutions, one of the things that we looked at and the things we ended up doing is that where possible, the group was matched against a past cohort with a similar profile doing the same task cycle. And so when a teacher had taught the same kind of learning cycle more than 1 year in a row, we looked for groups that had similar levels of English proficiency, so that we can say, this group did this task cycle without the use of planned translanguaging, and here's their output, their writing. And this group did the same task cycle with planned translanguaging, and this is their output. That wasn't always possible because not all of the teachers had done the task cycle previously. So where that wasn't possible, we measured against similar classes where we didn't disallow the use of the first language. So serendipitous translanguaging happened a lot, but we didn't implement the planned translanguaging cycle. And so not ideal, but the best solution we could come up with in terms of trying to find similar cohorts to measure impact. So what were the study outcomes? Well, first of all, as you all know, things this year didn't go the way we intended for anything. And so as Erin mentioned, 2 of the task cycles were carried out in person and 1 was carried out through distance learning, and that's obviously going to impact a lot. The one teacher did not participate, said that they would, and then kind of did some things, but nothing that was really consistent enough to be included in what we considered to be the use of the planned translanguaging cycle. And the feedback from the students all had to be taken distance, and so that limited as well how we could gather feedback from the students. The teachers were still on site at the school, and so that was, that could be done in different ways, but the students had all, as Erin mentioned, gone home. So what data did we collect? We have interview data from the participating teachers, which has not been dealt with yet, but will be. We have the survey on the perceptions of first language use from teachers and students. We're going to talk particularly about the student data today, because with only 3 participating teachers, we're aware that the teacher data will need to be treated very softly. And then again, we're still collecting from across the cycles the student work that we will assess through the use of a rubric. So I'm going to talk briefly about teacher perceptions, and I'm going to hand over to Erin for student perceptions. So overall, the teachers who participated felt that integrating first language into the class for planned pedagogical purposes had a positive impact on their groups. Their perceptions of the social and emotional impact were higher than their perceptions of the impact on learning. And again, that's the teacher's soft assessment. That's not coming from the data on the written samples. But across the board, I think that there's a need that teachers feel that to understand better how to plan for it effectively. And in the follow-up interviews, a lot of the talk focused around, I did it this way and it didn't really work, so I thought maybe next time I'll do it that way, and really highlighted the kind of ongoing process of trying to figure out how to make translanguaging work in a multilingual classroom where the teacher doesn't share the students' languages. So I'm going to hand back over to Erin now to talk about the raw data from the student perception surveys.
So as Eowyn mentioned, we had to do all the survey data remotely using a Google form, and we had about 23 respondents out of, I think, around 30 students who took part in the translanguaging strategies that were used in the class. And so, Eowyn, if you want to advance us to the next slide. So we gave them statements, and they had to rate themselves, their perception on a Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first statement was, using my home language to read for school helps me understand concepts and content in my classes. And you can see there largely that students lean towards agree or strongly agree that reading in their home language helped them academically. And you can see a similar trend on the next slide where for writing, the students seem to perceive that that writing in their home language helped them understand concepts and content in their classes. And in terms of, this was a little bit more neutral, or maybe evenly balanced between neutral and slightly positive, that using their home language for school helped them understand grammar and vocabulary in English. And I think this was corroborated by some of the feedback from teachers as well, myself included, that it was difficult to ascertain whether there was a measurable difference in terms of students' grammatical usage and lexical output and their writing. So that's something that we could look at a bit more closely. Using my home language for school helps me develop my home or mother tongue language skills. Again, this looked to be largely positive. Students, 15 of the 23 respondents or so seem to feel that this helped them maintain their home language, although you can see there's a few outliers there that perhaps disagreed. So that's perhaps worthy of further investigation as well. This was, I think, what Eowyn mentioned in terms of teacher perceptions, is that it seemed to be a positive experience at the affective or socio-emotional level, that students felt that it helped them feel connected to their culture and language. And so that's quite an interesting aspect of the data. And then again, we can see using my home language for school makes me feel like my teachers respect and value my culture and language. So I think, again, this underscored that students felt perhaps, if I can think my own interpretation was that students felt validated because their culture and language were included in their learning experience in the greater learning community. There was a chance for students to give sort of a short discursive response to a qualitative comment, typos included. But you'll notice that at the last comment there that's highlighted, it says, "At the beginning of the year, my home language helped me to understand the context of the assignments. But after some time, it seemed to me like a double assignments, and it was not so helpful." So it's something worthy of further exploration as well, is that at what proficiency, at what level do students feel that translanguaging doesn't actually help them, in terms of their acquisition of English and their learning of content, and also to what extent, at what level does translanguaging go from helping them acquire English to simply be a maintenance tool for maintaining their first language.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. So I'm just going to finish up with some takeaways and future directions. One of the main takeaways, and this is something I think that we knew going in was challenging, is that setting up a research program where the implementation of translanguaging is consistent enough to be comparable is difficult. And the way that we structured this this particular pilot project around the translanguaging cycle of input, processing, and output was meant to give that framework. Not all of the teachers adhered to it in ways that mean that we feel we can look at the data as comparable. And so, and again, there's a challenge with the control groups, what we're comparing to. And so, while we learned some things, we think that the challenge and scope and size needs to be dealt with in the sense that a bigger project will get more reliable results, but it's also much harder to manage. The more teachers that you have kind of trying to implement the cycle, the more variation there's likely to be in how they do it. And so really what we came away with is kind of more questions than answers. And these are some of the ones that just were brainstormed, particularly by Aaron, is which skills, reading or writing might be the best way to facilitate second language acquisition. So is reading in their first language more impactful or writing in their first language? Does it have a measurable effect on their home language development? And this is something obviously that we didn't have any way to measure. And so we asked, for student perceptions, but, is this a way that schools can commit to engaging in students' home language development rather than just saying, well, if they continue to develop in their own language, that's good, but it's not our job? How does it make students feel about their learning experience? And so, we tapped into that, some of that through the Likert scale, but it would be nice to have some interview data as well from students just to, get a better sense of how it feels. I know that kind of anecdotally, sometimes students are resistant to using their own language in class because they feel it's a bit illicit. And so it'd be nice to have fuller data on that. Leading back to the comment that Aaron highlighted from one of the students, which levels is translanguaging most suitable for, if at all? So are there levels of English language proficiency, or say the level of language of instruction proficiency, that mean that translanguaging is most effective, or that it's overkill? Can it be elective for students? In this particular case, it was kind of mandated, you do this in your language, you do this in your language. Can it be something that students are allowed to do but are not required to do? And also, one of the kind of rising questions is, what about semilingual students? And semilingual is kind of an old-fashioned word. We don't use it very much anymore. In this context, we're using it for students who can speak a language but can't write it. And so if we want to scaffold through their strongest language for academic content and they can't read in their own language, that becomes problematic, or right. Limitations and conclusions. Obviously it's still in progress. We have data still to analyze. We are behind schedule, as most people are. So the thematic analysis of the data and the writing. The teacher data is too small to draw conclusions, but can be used to develop future research projects. And student perceptions are overall positive. Now we need to take that and find out if it actually makes a difference for them. So that's the end of the slide share, and I think that's time for questions. We went a little bit over, for which I apologize.
That's absolutely fine, Eowyn and Aaron. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk, and as you say, very, very nicely matching some of the elements of Rais's talk. And my commiserations go out to you with the messiness of doing this talk, this sort of research with teacher pedagogy, because I do the same myself, but we just have to keep plugging away there, even in the pandemic. So great to see you both doing such interesting research. Thank you. Our first question that I got up here comes from Fazri, and it says, how do you come to a conclusion when analysing my understanding of grammar and vocabulary is a strongly agree and or versus agree? So I think he's looking at what do you think were the fine-grained differences in children's responses when talking about their understanding of grammar and vocabulary? Is it possible to know that from your data?
It's not possible to know that from our data. We were just looking for, how the students feel about the process and their own particular, reflections on what it may or may not have done for them. As I mentioned in the limitations, we're not actually measuring at this point. Now there is, the data that will be analyzed on the written output will indicate to some extent if, say, English, their English language skills across vocabulary or grammar are better than the previous cohorts who didn't have the planned translanguaging pedagogy, but we won't be able to align that with the student perceptions because those were anonymous.
Thank you. Uta asks, she says, first of all, it's very interesting research, absolutely agree with her. I'm looking forward, she says, to seeing what will come out of it. Were all the students able to read and write in their L1? She's actually got several questions here, so that's the first one.
So I think we addressed that in the final slide, that no, there was in particular one student who couldn't read and write in his own language,
right.
Which was Farsi, and so he scribed phonetically to see if that would help, but that is a different question and would need, a kind of different cohorts to have enough data to speak to that in any kind of reliable way.
She goes on to ask, what about students who didn't receive consistent formal teaching in L1? So in a way that you're right, that's part of another study, I guess.
It is, but that's not a particular, that's not the case here, because these students have all come to this school, a vast majority from their own countries and their own national systems, majority. So that's why there was only one student who wasn't literate in his own language.
Right.
It would be different in a traditional international school where the kids are starting when they're 3 and 4 years old.
So very context specific. Thank you. Jess asks, just wondering if the children had to move countries frequently. This might impact on whether they link their using their home language. Sorry. This might impact on whether they think using their home language is useful to their learning process.
Aaron, do you want to take that one? You know the students better.
Sure. Yeah. And certainly some of our students are maybe children of parents from multinational companies who've moved around, and perhaps English would be their strongest academic language. But in these particular classes, because we use a placement test to ascertain whether they should be in sort of language acquisition focused classes, these students were by and large came from their national systems and their home countries, and this was their first experience studying in through English medium instruction. And so other than the one student that Eowyn mentioned who had been sort of in a British school, maybe in his home country in Iran, the rest of them had been educated and were literate, highly academically literate in their home languages.
Thank you. Joseph has a question which I'm sure we all have. He says, thanks for this great presentation. He says, I'm curious as how the move to distance learning affected the pedagogical practices. What sort of qualitative changes did you see between in-person and online teaching?
I'll leave that with you, Aaron.
Okay. Yes, so that's a big question. I guess in terms of the research question here, what I did in my own experience was I had students, we used Google Classroom for students to get input and some other online tools, and then we asked students to submit work through Google Classroom, and then in the cases where I asked students to write or draft in their home languages, I asked them to just do it by hand and then take a picture with their phone and then upload the image. So I could verify that they did do the draft, had gone through the drafting process. And then we used, because we were already using some the students, because by and large the students at our school are affluent, they also, they have laptops and access to technology and good Wi-Fi connections that allowed them to collaborate synchronously and asynchronously. So they did, peer editing exercises. Qualitatively, from my perspective, I felt like, obviously something is lost when you're not physically present in a classroom, especially when you're a teenager. But I was impressed that in my particular case that the students were actively engaged online, and we met once a week, to chat live, and I had students in Japan and Brazil. So, they're 12 hours apart, but we managed to get together once a week and make it work. And hopefully they'll be back here at the end of August.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and well done for carrying on regardless in what's incredibly challenging circumstances for all researchers. So John asks about, he's asking about something called the bilingual DP. That doesn't mean anything to me. Does it mean anything to you? It does. Good.
Yes.
That's good then.
Yeah,
I'll go on with the question then. Are any or all of the students in this study pursuing the bilingual DP, he asks?
That's a good question. In my class, yes, but that was maybe only about a quarter of the students in the study. So in this, for those of you that are familiar or not familiar with the International Baccalaureate program, if they're taking English B, which is English as English language acquisition, as opposed to, I guess, first language English, the study of literature, they also do what's called the school supported self-taught option, where they take a literature-based course in their own language with support from a tutor, usually in our case, a remote tutor. So for example, my student from Japan, she might have a tutor helping her to do Japanese literature, and she'll take English language acquisition, my course, and she gets a bilingual diploma.
Okay.
But the younger students, we don't know what their trajectory is because they don't have
Okay.
to do the IB diploma.
Okay, there's a follow-up to that. John, I apologize. I'm going to move on because there are a few other questions. We just have a few minutes left. So Robert asks, he says, very interesting work, Aaron and Eowyn. One dependent variable you are still looking at is written output. Why didn't you include a formal proficiency test?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the students are measured on their English proficiency before they start at the school. That with standardized testing, and so their proficiency in English on the way in is known. The reason we didn't use a standardized test after is because we want to look at the impact on the writing output from a particular cycle. So does reading about, I don't know, the causes of World War I in their own language mean that their ideas about World War I are more developed than if we only let them, if they only research in English? And so I think that, we want to see if it helps develop their English in the context and not just for the purposes of a standardized test. And so that wouldn't work for what we're trying to ascertain.
Thank you, Eowyn. Here's another one. Pearl says, thank you for your presentation. Could you say something more about the emotional aspect that the teachers mentioned? From the presentation, the students feel more respected in translanguaging classrooms. So is the emotional aspect possibly related to foreign language enjoyment, or in general using the language in talking about emotions? Got quite a lot going on in there.
Oh, yeah. No, I think it's not in terms of talking about emotions, but just in terms of how it makes them feel in the class. So are they comfortable and happy in the classroom? Do they, are they integrated? All of those kinds of things. And how do they feel when doing group work? So it's more to do with their, their inclusion. And, anecdotally, we see a lot, kids who are isolated, who can't speak English very well, don't kind of fit in with their classes and classmates. And so I think the teachers were reflecting more on kind of the cohesion and how it made kids feel in the class, and not so much about talking about emotions. I don't know if Aaron wants to add anything about that, because you did it.
Yeah, no, I think I just briefly, I think it just is in the sense of affirming their identity, that their language and their culture is accepted in the classroom, and it's not something to be shut out of the classroom.
Thank you both. Pia asks, thanks very much for sharing your research. Smiley face. I was wondering if you've had the chance to explore the possible reasons for what seems to be a discrepancy between teachers and students' perceptions about translanguaging.
I'm not sure what discrepancy we're talking about.
Maybe could it be that the students don't want to do it, perhaps, or they don't feel it's valuable because they're there to learn English, and there's that discrepancy between wanting to be focused on English language acquisition versus us wanting to promote the other language so that it reinforces both that language and English. I guess maybe that's part of the answer.
Okay, and a final one, which I'm sure a lot of people might be interested in, is can you share some more about the actual translanguaging strategies that are used in this pedagogy you're using?
I can speak to that. Yeah. Just, I mean, when we were exploring a particular topic or a theme, I would require students to find a reliable, what they deemed a self-selected reliable source. So they had to first read about it in their home language, so they had the conceptual understanding, there, so they had that schema to build on when they then read other texts that I prescribed in English. And then when we were working towards the end of the unit, and their summative assessment often revolved around some kind of writing task, then they would have to work in pairs or small groups with students who shared their language. In my class, it was Mandarin and Portuguese, where there were shared languages, and they'd have to co-draft a writing task in that language by hand. And then individually, they would take those tasks and then produce their final summative in English, typed through Google Documents, shared through Google Classroom. And so those are just a few strategies. We also did a lot of vocabulary work where they had to self-select vocabulary, and then they had to identify the home language and decide if it was a cognate and things like that. So
Great.
Focused on vocabulary, reading input in the initial stages of content, and then also output in the drafting stages before producing something in English that could be assessed by the teacher.
Great, all great translanguaging pedagogies, which I'm sure we would all share in agreement with as them being excellent strategies. Thank you so much, Eowyn and Aaron. Let's have some clapping and some huge amounts of thank you from our 250 participants.